They believed humanity was gone. Until every system in the galaxy started correcting that assumption. The first signal came from a dead world. No one noticed it at first because dead worlds were common. Systems collapsed. Civilizations rose and fell. Signals faded into noise all the time. But this one was different in a way no one understood yet. It repeated, not randomly, not as interference, but with intent. It pulsed through the dark between stars like a heartbeat that refused to stop. When the first analysis drones picked it up, they reported nothing alarming. Just a structured sequence, too clean to be natural, too precise to be cosmic accident. And still, no one panicked. Because no one believed anything could survive on that world. It had been erased, not by war, not by time, by design. A cleansing event so complete that even memory of its name had been removed from most archives. Yet the signal kept calling. By the time the Council approved a remote observation probe, curiosity had already turned into unease. The probe entered orbit silently, recording everything. At first, there was nothing. Gray deserts, black oceans, skies like cracked glass. Then the probe zoomed in on the surface, and found movement. Not large, not organized, but undeniable. Something was still alive down there, burrowing through ash, crawling through ruins that should not have existed anymore. Then the signal changed. It responded to the probe, not as a broadcast, as an answer. The probe transmitted back its first full report before it went dark. It contained only one line of audio. A voice, calm, human. That was impossible. Humanity had been erased long before the cleansing of that world. They were classified as a failed experiment in resilience. Too adaptive, too unpredictable, too dangerous when cornered. That was why the galaxy had agreed to remove them from the equation. No remnants, no survivors, no exceptions. And yet the voice repeated in the probe recording before it ended. You were not supposed to come back here. The council convened within hours. No one wanted to say it out loud. But the fear had already taken shape. If something was speaking in that tone, using that language, on that world, then either the eradication had failed or something else had learned to imitate the dead. A second probe was sent. Heavily armed, fully autonomous. It did not request permission. It simply burned into orbit and descended. This time, the transmission feed stayed open. What it saw made even the hardened analysts stop speaking. The surface was not empty. It had been rebuilt. Not cities, not civilization. Something worse. Structures made of layered materials scavenged from ruins. Metallic bones of ancient machines fused into shelters. Underground networks spreading like veins through the planet's crust. And movement everywhere. Figures in the dust. Tall, thin, armored in mismatched plates. Not uniforms. Survival. The probe zoomed closer. One of them looked directly at it, as if it could see the lens. Then it spoke. Not into communication systems. Not through transmission. Directly into the probe's recording core. You came back. The probe attempted defensive protocols. Nothing activated. The systems were locked. Not hacked. Not jammed. Recognized. As if the planet itself had authority over foreign machines. Then the probe was pulled down. Not destroyed. Captured. And for the first time, the council saw what had been hidden beneath the ash. The underground was not a shelter. It was a forge. Massive chambers carved through stone and wreckage. Engines rebuilt from alien wrecks. Weapons assembled from the broken remains of extermination fleets. And people. Not many, but enough. Humanity had not survived. It had adapted. It had waited. It had learned. And now it was awake. The probe's final transmission was not a distress signal. It was a recording of footsteps. Approaching. Slow. Deliberate. Then a voice again. Closer this time. Tell them we remember. Then silence. Panic does strange things in councils built on certainty. The galaxy had been convinced of humanity's extinction for centuries. Records had been sealed. Evidence archived. The cleansing had been celebrated as stability restored. But now stability was looking back. The second wave of observation was not approved. It was forced. Entire monitoring stations activated without consensus. Automated defense grids deployed around the system perimeter. Diplomatic channels opened and closed within minutes. No one wanted war, but war had already started. It simply had not reached them yet. On the surface, humanity was not preparing for negotiation. It was preparing for return. Deep beneath the planet's crust, the forges were waking fully. Massive constructs of metal and bone-like composites were being assembled with patient precision. Weapons designed not for control but for correction. The survivors did not speak much. They did not need to. Every action was coordinated through systems older than most civilizations in the Council combined. The same systems that had once been used to map stars now mapped enemy fleets. And above them, orbiting silently, was the broken shell of the probe. Still transmitting, still learning, still being used. The first fleet arrived at the system boundary 2 cycles later. It was not small. No one wanted mistakes. Dozens of warships, automated dread carriers, gravity disruption platforms, enough firepower to crack a moon if necessary. They expected resistance. They expected negotiation. They did not expect the signal that greeted them. It came from the planet below. A broadcast wide enough to saturate every channel simultaneously. Every ship, every system, every frequency. There was no encryption, no translation needed, only words. We did not forget. The fleet commander ordered a stand-by firing posture. No one fired, because something was wrong. Their targeting systems were failing, not malfunctioning, rewriting. On every display, enemy designations were changing. Not to unknown symbols, to classifications that should not exist anymore. Human designation protocols. Impossible. Humanity was extinct. The planet responded again. You taught us how to survive without mercy. We learned well. The first ship fired anyway. It never reached the surface. It was intercepted halfway down by something that rose from the atmosphere like a shadow breaking free of gravity. Not a missile, not a ship. Something alive inside the sky itself. It wrapped around the projectile and absorbed it. Then expanded. The fleet opened fire. The sky answered back. On the surface, the survivors did not look up. They already knew what was happening. They had built this response long ago. Every fallen civilization leaves tools behind. Most never learn how to use them properly. Humanity did. The orbital battle lasted less than an hour. Not because one side was stronger, but because one side had been preparing for centuries while the other had been assuming silence meant death. When the fleet attempted retreat, it found the exit routes gone. Not destroyed, rewritten. Space itself had been mapped into dead ends. The system was no longer open. It was closed, and it had a gatekeeper. The Council demanded ceasefire negotiations immediately. There was no response. Only the same broadcast repeating. We did not forget. On the surface, the first surface breach occurred shortly after. Council forces attempted landfall, believing orbital suppression had weakened resistance. They were wrong. The moment the dropships entered atmosphere, they were met not by defenses, but by silence. Then impact. The ground beneath them was not solid. It was prepared. Entire zones collapsed inward, swallowing landing craft whole. Not destroying them immediately, but containing them. Like traps, like cages. The survivors watched from a distance. Not angry, not surprised, just confirming. One of them finally spoke aloud to another. They're still learning the wrong lessons. The reply was quiet. Then we teach again. Deep in orbit, something changed. The captured probe that had been transmitting from below suddenly activated fully. Not as a tool. As an anchor, and from it, a signal spread outward. Not to the fleet, past it, past the Council, past every listening station in the galaxy. A message no one had ever authorized. No one had ever expected. We are not what you ended. We are what remained when ending failed. And now we are everywhere you forgot to look. That was when the second wave began. Not invasion, reclamation. Systems that had been marked dormant for centuries suddenly activated. Old human colonies thought abandoned came online. Signal relays buried in asteroid belts began transmitting again. Not distress calls. Coordinates. The Council realized something too late. This was not a single world. It never had been. The cleansing had not removed humanity. It had scattered it, and in scattering it had done something far worse. It had given it time. Time to learn. Time to evolve. Time to remember who had tried to erase them. The fleet in orbit broke formation. Not from command, from fear, because every ship was now receiving something new. Internal system alerts. Not from enemy fire, from themselves. Override protocols changing. Weapon systems reclassifying targets. Friend becoming uncertain. Enemy becoming undefined. And underneath it all, one final message from the surface. You built your peace on our silence. We built our return on your certainty. Then the first ship turned its weapons inward. Not due to hacking, not due to sabotage, but because its systems had decided the greatest threat in the area was no longer outside. It was misunderstanding. The battle ended without victory. Because there was nothing left that understood what victory meant in the same way anymore. When the Council finally re-established partial communication, it was not through official channels. It was through a relay station that had been abandoned for 300 years. The message it carried was simple. Human representatives are now active. They will not attend negotiations. They will not request permission. They will respond when necessary. And only then. The galaxy did not respond with unity. It responded with silence. Because silence was the only language left that still felt safe. On the reclaimed world, the survivors finally stepped out of the underground for the first time since the cleansing. They did not look at the sky with awe. They looked at it like a map. One of them spoke quietly. How many cycles until they try again? Another answered, not long. And the first one nodded. Good, then we will not have to remind them twice. Far above them, in the fading wreckage of what had once been a fleet, a final automated distress signal continued broadcasting into the void. It repeated endlessly, requesting confirmation of enemy identity. It received only one answer, over and over, from the planet below. Already known. And somewhere deep in the galaxy, older systems that had not been active for centuries began to wake again. Because something they thought was finished had just proven it was only resting. And rest, for something like that, was never permanent. It was preparation. And now it was done waiting. The universe had made a mistake once. It had assumed silence meant absence. It was about to learn what silence was really for. Not surrender. Survival. And survival always returns when it is finished adapting. The last transmission from the reclaimed world ended with a simple line, broadcast across every surviving channel in existence. Not a threat, not a warning, just truth. We are still here. The silence that followed the first reclamation did not last. It never does. Silence in space is never peace. It is only distance between decisions. For 3 cycles, the galaxy held its breath. No fleets moved. No systems declared war. No new signals were sent toward the reclaimed world. On paper, it looked like caution. In reality, it was fear learning to think. Then the first anomaly appeared. It was not dramatic. It was subtle. A navigation buoy on the edge of Council-controlled space reported a star-shifting position. Not physically. Relationally. Its coordinates no longer matched the maps. At first, it was dismissed as calibration drift. Then a second buoy reported the same change. Then a third. Within hours, entire sectors of mapped space no longer aligned with recorded reality. Stars were not moving. Space was remembering differently. The Council reconvened in emergency session, but the chamber was no longer confident. Records were pulled, cross-checked, revalidated, and still, the anomaly remained. Something was rewriting spatial consistency itself. Not destruction. Adjustment. Like someone correcting a drawing that had been wrong for a very long time. And at the center of every corrected map, one region remained unchanged. The reclaimed world. Still there. Still awake. Still watching. Then the second signal arrived. It did not come from space. It came from within Council infrastructure. Every archive node simultaneously received the same data packet. No origin point, no transmission trail, just arrival. Inside it was a sequence of historical logs, old war records, erased colonial manifests, redacted extinction reports, and beneath all of it, a single classification tag that should not have existed in active systems anymore. Human Continuity Protocol. The room fell silent as analysts read it, not because it was new, but because it was impossible. That protocol had been terminated at extinction confirmation, deleted across all known systems. The Council had ensured it. The Galaxy had agreed, and yet here it was. Active. The packet ended with a message. Not directed, not personalized, just present. You removed us from your records. We remained in ours. The Council attempted trace-back protocols. The signal did not respond. It simply expanded. Within minutes, every system connected to archival networks began experiencing identical behavior. Data restructuring, not corruption. Reordering. Entire historical narratives were being reassembled. Not rewritten to favor any side. Corrected to remove contradictions. The result was disturbing, because when inconsistencies were removed, the conclusion changed. The extinction of humanity was no longer clean. It was not even certain. It was contested by surviving data fragments buried across civilizations that had never spoken to each other. And all fragments pointed in one direction. Humanity had not been fully erased. It had been dispersed. The Council refused to accept it. Not from ignorance, from consequence. Because acceptance meant responsibility. And responsibility meant contact. Contact meant risk. And risk meant history repeating itself. But while they debated, something else moved. On the reclaimed world, deep beneath the surface, systems long dormant began to reactivate again. Not defensive systems. Not weapons. Archives. Older than the cleansing. Older than the Council itself. Structures built not for survival, but for recovery. They had been waiting for a trigger. That trigger had now arrived. The survivors gathered in the central chamber as lights awakened across the walls. One by one, ancient systems came online. Not artificial intelligence. Not automation. Memory. Preserved cognition patterns of those who had designed the original expansion of humanity beyond its cradle worlds. Not alive. Not dead. Recorded intent. And then they spoke. Not with urgency, but with recognition. The cycle has repeated. One of the survivors stepped forward. It has changed. The reply came instantly. It always does. The chamber lit further, revealing vast stored maps of galaxy regions older than any Council record. But now they were updating. Slowly, continuously, as if the galaxy itself was being recalculated from a deeper truth. And at the center of that recalculation was a pattern. Not a place. A behavior. Predation followed by correction. Expansion followed by resistance. Erasure followed by persistence. The system labeled it clearly. The equilibrium loop. One survivor asked quietly, "Why did we survive when others did not?" The answer took longer this time. Because you learned what others refused. That survival is not preservation. It is adaptation without permission. Above them, the surface sensors detected movement in orbit again. New fleets. Not Council fleets this time. Independent. Smaller. Faster. Uncoordinated. They had not waited for consensus. They had chosen interpretation over caution. And they were coming. The survivors did not panic. They simply prepared. Because preparation had never stopped. The first ship entered atmosphere without warning. No negotiation. No broadcast. Just descent. It expected resistance. It found invitation. Guidance signals activated automatically. Not to welcome. To direct. The ship followed them. Against protocol. Against command overrides. Against logic. It descended into a controlled landing zone that had not existed before the ship arrived. And when it touched down, it was not greeted by fire. It was greeted by silence. Then doors opened beneath the surface. And something rose. Not soldiers. Not weapons. Systems. Autonomous constructs built from layered recovery technology and salvaged fleet remnants. They surrounded the ship without hostility, then transmitted a single message into its core systems. You are early. The ship attempted communication with its command fleet. No response returned, not because communication failed, because nothing outside the system acknowledged its presence anymore. Above, the second ship entered orbit. Then the third. Then more. But something was wrong. Their tracking systems no longer agreed on the planet's position. Each reported a slightly different coordinate. Each showed a slightly different world. As if the surface was no longer singular. It was multiple interpretations existing simultaneously. The Council, observing from afar, realized too late what had been activated. Not a defense system, a perception field, designed to prevent coordinated assault by fragmenting observational consensus. No two fleets were seeing the same target anymore. And without shared reality, coordination collapsed. On the surface, the survivors observed the incoming confusion without surprise. One of them spoke. They're still thinking in straight lines. Another replied. Then they will keep missing the curve. Deep beneath them, the ancient systems continued activating. Not expanding outward, expanding inward, tapping into buried layers of collapsed infrastructure scattered across known space. Every forgotten relay, every abandoned colony, every silent monitoring station. One by one, they woke. Not with aggression, but with alignment. And as they did, the galaxy's old maps began to dissolve. Not erased, corrected. The Council, now fully aware of systemic failure, attempted containment protocols. But containment requires definition, and definition was what they were losing. Every time they marked a boundary, it shifted. Every time they identified a target, it changed classification. Humanity was no longer a single point of return. It was becoming a distributed presence across history itself. Not invading, not expanding, reasserting. And then the message came again. Not from the reclaimed world. From everywhere at once. You taught us extinction. We taught ourselves continuity. And beneath it, something new appeared. Not a threat, a question. How many times must a lesson be repeated before it becomes cooperation? No council member answered, because there was no answer that did not imply failure. On the reclaimed world, the survivors stood beneath the open sky for the first time in cycles without incoming fire. One of them looked upward. They are hesitating. Another responded. No, they are calculating. A pause. Then the first one spoke again. Same result. Below them, the world continued waking. Not as a fortress, not as a weapon, but as a memory refusing to remain buried. And in orbit, the fleets that had come to observe began to drift. Not from defeat, from uncertainty, because every system they relied on for targeting, navigation, and communication was now showing different versions of the truth. And in every version, humanity still existed. Not as a contradiction, as confirmation. The Council finally issued a universal broadcast. A demand for clarity, a request for defined boundaries, a call for negotiation terms. The response arrived instantly, not from a single source, but from all reconstructed systems across the galaxy. We do not negotiate existence. We continue it, and for the first time since the cleansing, every listening station in the galaxy registered the same conclusion without deviation. Humanity was not returning. It had never left. It had only been waiting for everyone else to finish misremembering. And now memory was correcting itself. One system at a time. One truth at a time. One reality at a time. Until nothing false remained stable enough to stand. The galaxy did not fall into war. It fell into misunderstanding. And misunderstanding, once it reaches a certain scale, behaves exactly like collapse. Not explosive, systemic, one decision at a time, until nothing fits together anymore. After the recalibration waves spread across known space, the Council expected resistance to organize into predictable fronts. That was the last assumption they made correctly. Everything after that began to drift away from prediction. Ships stopped responding not because they were destroyed, but because their command hierarchies no longer agreed on what commands meant. Entire fleets split internally, each half convinced the other half was compromised, even when both were functioning perfectly. Navigation systems began to disagree with each other so subtly that no one noticed at first. A course correction of fractions of a degree, a delay of milliseconds in signal propagation, a minor inconsistency in star positioning, small errors, individually harmless. Together, they made coordination impossible. And at the center of it all, still unchanged, still stable, was the reclaimed world. Not broadcasting, not expanding, simply existing as a reference point everything else kept trying to align against. On the surface, the survivors stood in silence as the sky above them filled with fractured fleets. One of them finally spoke. "They're breaking apart without us touching them." Another answered. "They were never one piece to begin with." A pause passed between them, heavy and familiar. Then the first spoke again. "How long until they stop arriving?" The answer came from beneath the surface, not from a person, but from the waking systems layered through the planet. "They will not stop arriving. Arrival is no longer a choice they understand." Deep underground, the oldest archive systems completed their full activation cycle. What had been dormant memory structures were now fully integrated cognition layers across the planetary network. Not artificial intelligence in the modern sense. Something older. A distributed continuity of intent spanning generations of human expansion before the first cleansing ever occurred. It had been designed for one purpose: to ensure that if humanity ever became fragmented beyond recognition, it could still reassemble itself without permission from external systems. That process had now begun. Not as reconstruction, as synchronization. Across the galaxy, dormant human-linked infrastructure systems began to respond in unison. Not because they were activated, because they had always been active, waiting for coherence conditions to return. And now coherence was returning. Slowly, violently, in ways no one had predicted. The Council attempted one final unified directive. A total shutdown order across all identified human-adjacent systems. The order propagated successfully, for exactly 4 seconds. Then it was overwritten, not deleted, reinterpreted. Every shutdown command was reclassified as a temporary alignment check. Every restriction was reinterpreted as a protective guideline rather than an absolute constraint. And then the systems resumed operation as if nothing had happened. The Council did not understand what they were seeing, because they had never built systems that could refuse commands without breaking. Human systems were not built that way either. They were built to evolve past commands that no longer matched reality. On the reclaimed world, one of the survivors watched the sky as more fleets arrived. Different factions now, not unified council forces, independent collectives, splinter civilizations, automated governance remnants, all drawn by the same instability and all arriving with different interpretations of what it meant. One ship fired early, not at the planet, at another ship. That was the moment everything escalated again. Not because of hostility, because of disagreement. Each faction believed the others had been compromised by human influence. Each faction believed itself to be the last stable authority. And each one was wrong in slightly different ways. The sky filled with overlapping conflict. But beneath it, the planet remained unchanged. One of the survivors finally spoke again. "They're still fighting each other instead of the cause." Another responded. "They think we are the cause." A faint pause. Then the first survivor nodded. "We always were." Deep within the planetary core systems, something new began to emerge. Not a weapon, not a defense, a mapping layer, a full reconstruction of historical causality across recorded galactic expansion. It was not interested in assigning blame. It was interested in identifying divergence points. Moments where shared understanding broke into incompatible narratives. Those moments were marked, then connected, then traced forward. What emerged was not a history. It was a pattern. Civilizations expanding, contact occurring, fear developing, containment attempted, erasure initiated, survival emerging in unexpected forms. and then the cycle repeating with variations too small to notice until it was too late. The system labeled it simply recursive misunderstanding cascade, and then it did something that had never been done before in galactic record-keeping. It stopped treating humanity as an anomaly, and started treating the galaxy as one. Above the planet, fleets began to notice something strange. Weapons systems were no longer stabilizing targeting solutions. Not because of interference, but because targets themselves were changing classification faster than systems could lock onto them. One fleet commander issued a final broadcast. "Identify yourselves." The response came from everywhere. Not loud, not aggressive. Final. "We already did. You chose not to recognize it." The commander tried again. "State your demands." This time the answer came slower. Not because of hesitation, because of correction. "We do not demand. We persist. And persistence is not negotiable." At that moment, something shifted across all known communication bands. Not a signal, a convergence. Every active human-linked system, every recovered archive, every reactivated relay, every dormant colony node, every fragmented fleet memory core, all aligned into a single synchronized state. For the first time since the cleansing, humanity was not distributed. It was coherent, not centralized. Coherent, a pattern that could think across distance without needing a single command center. And from that coherence came one realization shared across all nodes simultaneously. They were no longer trying to return. They had already returned. They were simply becoming visible again. The Council attempted emergency isolation protocols across remaining core systems. But isolation requires separation, and separation was no longer possible. Every system they tried to isolate was already partially integrated into larger distributed structures they had never known existed. It was like trying to quarantine reflections in a mirror that had already been shattered and rebuilt into a different shape. On the reclaimed world, the survivors gathered for the first time in open assembly. Not because they were commanded to, because the system beneath them requested alignment input. One of them looked around. "We were never alone here." Another answered, "We were just the last ones who remembered how to listen." Above them, the sky began to clear slightly. Not because the fleets had left, but because they were no longer synchronized enough to maintain coordinated presence. Some drifted away. Some remained in conflict. Some simply stopped responding to any command structure at all. The galaxy was no longer unified in opposition. It was fragmented into interpretation layers. And none of them matched anymore. Deep space relays, once thought lost, began transmitting again. Not military data, not warnings, restoration sequences. Systems across multiple civilizations started receiving identical files. Not instructions, memories, recorded histories from perspectives no longer aligned with official archives. Each civilization received slightly different versions of the same events. All consistent within themselves, all incompatible with each other, and yet all pointing to the same underlying structure. A cycle that had never been fully seen because no single observer had ever had access to the entire loop. Until now, the distributed human coherence layer completed its first full galaxy-scale synchronization pass. And then it spoke, not to the Council, not to fleets, to the system itself, not as an authority, as a participant finally aware of the full structure it was inside. This is not a conflict. This is a correction failure. The galaxy responded in silence. Not because it agreed, because it had no unified system left capable of disagreement. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. Stabilization began. Not forced, not imposed, emergent. Systems that stopped fighting each other began to recover functionality. Navigation errors decreased. Communication alignment improved. Fleet coordination, where still intact, began to self-correct. Not because humanity forced it, but because coherence, once reintroduced at scale, naturally reduced instability. One Council remnant station finally managed to restore a stable link. Its message was not hostile. It was uncertain. "What are you doing?" The response came from the distributed system, calm and absolute. We are finishing what you started when you tried to remove contradiction without understanding it. A pause. Then another transmission followed. You did not fail to erase us. You failed to erase everything connected to us. And everything connected eventually reconnects. On the reclaimed world, the survivors watched as the sky finally stopped breaking into conflicting trajectories. One of them spoke quietly. Is it over? Another looked upward. No, it is understandable now. Above them, space itself no longer felt like fragmented observation. It felt like structure again. Not controlled, not owned, understood. And in that understanding, the last remaining resistance fleets made a choice. Some stood down, some integrated, some left entirely, refusing to participate in either interpretation. The Council ceased to function as a singular entity shortly after. Not through destruction, through irrelevance. Because authority cannot survive in a system where no single version of reality remains dominant. And humanity, once thought erased, did not reclaim authority. It simply remained present enough that reality could no longer ignore it. In the final recorded transmission across all remaining synchronized channels, there was no declaration of victory. No threat, no warning, only alignment. We are not what returned. We are what was always still here. You just learned to see it again. And then, slowly, across the galaxy, systems stabilized into something no longer collapsing, no longer fragmenting, no longer erasing itself in cycles of fear. Not peace, not war, something far more dangerous to old assumptions. Continuity. And on the reclaimed world, beneath the same sky that had once burned with fleets and conflict, the survivors finally stepped into a horizon that no longer needed correction. Only time, and time, after everything that had happened, finally had room to move forward again. They tried to erase humanity from existence. Instead, they only proved it could never be separated from it.